But the subject of today would have been really talking about the role of evidence in creation of knowledge within the humanitarian space, and particularly about the idea of quantifying needs in humanitarian space, which is not necessarily something that is as obvious as it maybe might seem, just thinking about the fact that obviously we need evidence to implement, but it's an arc, it's a process, and there are quite a few things that have changed and evolved over time, and those different discourses that exist within that space continue battling with each other. And whether you're doing your work as part of the practitioner side of things, or whether you're approaching it from the researcher side, you will keep on battling with those conflicting discourses and making choices as a function of your basically sometimes gut feeling, but also circumstances and environment in which you were working. What I wanted to basically do is go through those points. First and foremost, talk to you a little bit more about the history of humanitarian assessments, very briefly, just to give you a sense of how that came about. Then I wanted to talk about the key types of assessments and their applications. So what do we mean by humanitarian assessments? And then kind of the key bit where I think it's most interesting is those discourses and the controversies around how to approach certain subjects, and wrap up with the idea of, well, my role as an M&E practitioner versus the researcher hat, which is something that is probably of interest to you to understand how you can try to juggle the two, and how at some point ultimately also make a choice whether you're on one or the other side most of the time. So without further ado, just to set the ground, what is really key to understand that any assessment that you might be doing, and anything that when we talk about humanitarian work, is always underpinned by those 4 humanitarian principles, and that's the moral aspect of the work. Whether you're doing research or you're implementing, there's no way of being able to think about doing that work without addressing the needs, which are directly derived from those 4 principles. So the impartiality, which basically always looks at how we're providing the support. And the idea is fundamental in here that we only do that on the basis of needs. So it's supposed to be proportional to the need. And it relates to this repartition clause that there's a triage. So the urgency of the need that is supposed to be the guiding principle of who gets the need and who gets the support and who gets it first. Then there's the humanity, where we look at what's the ultimate goal and what's the reason why we're supporting a population. And in humanitarian setting, it's about saving lives and alleviating suffering. So it looks specifically at that first part and doesn't really delve into the development goals. Nowadays, there's also obviously the whole discussion about whether we can limit humanitarian aid to just immediate needs of saving lives and alleviating suffering, because of a consequent nexus between peace and development and humanitarian, which means that when we do humanitarian work, we also should be thinking a little bit longer term and see how the humanitarian assistance is contributing to recovery, for instance, and resilience, disaster risk reduction. But the primary goal of humanitarian assistance is to focus on life saving and alleviating suffering coming from disasters. Men or not men. Then there's the neutrality, which means that when acting, we're not supposed to be really siding with any part of the conflict, and that's crucial to be able to act as a humanitarian. Otherwise, your neutrality being compromised, you put yourself and the population in danger. And lastly, and probably the most difficult one to navigate, is the impartiality. just basically ensuring that whatever aid is being provided, it is not conditioned by any agendas, whether they are political or economic or social. So we're not an implementing partner for any government or any agency specifically. That it's clear that this is, again, going back to neutrality and humanity. The goal is to save lives without differentiating and without implementing anything per se, apart from supporting the population in need, based on needs only. So they're all kind of interrelated, but unpacking that always goes back to those 4 principles. It will be repeated over and over again every time that someone's trying to understand whether we've done the right thing. And that's quite important when we look at assessments, obviously, as well. So when we talk about the beginning of the assessments in humanitarian settings, we're actually looking at the birth of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. So I believe it's like 1859 is the Battle of Solferino, where the Red Crescent and movement was born with Henri Dunant, basically finding himself in the battlefield and seeing casualties and trying to establish a way of supporting soldiers on both sides of the conflict, regardless of whether they were, I think, Austrians and Italians or French. Sorry, I don't remember really right now, but it was just a big battlefield, lots of casualties there. He was in the middle of that and basically trying to come up with a way of trying to also come up with a way of who gets the aid first, and that is done without taking into consideration whether you are of this or that nationality, purely based on the idea of triage, so the need and the urgency. And then that kind of kept on evolving from just looking at casualties in the battlefield into other types of support. So the Red Crescent was born and then transformed themselves, started developing Geneva Conventions, which are looking more broadly about working within the humanitarian space and trying to address the needs of disaster-affected populations. And initially, like the assessments and the idea of needs was quite narrow. When we think about it right now from our contemporary perspective, it was quite narrow. And we were looking mostly at the basic needs, which were understood as food, shelter, water, and medical care. And I think medical care obviously was the, as you can probably sense from Red Cross starting point, it was the core and the beginning of all that thinking. And that obviously kept on evolving into something which is slightly more complex. So as the sector started to also become much more populated, so it's not just Red Crescent, Red Cross, and there are more actors appearing on the arena. The idea of needs started to broaden as well. And the assessment started to include not just the immediate needs, but also take into account more of the social, economic, and political factors that might contribute to the vulnerability of the populations that the humanitarian aid is trying to support. And I think what maybe is worth also noting in here is that that shift to broaden the scope of aid is in a way also coinciding with the difference in understanding what is development, and probably I'm not sure if that's something that resonates with you, but there is an entire whole shift in how we understand human development from looking purely as development from a GDP perspective, for instance, into more contextualized and also much more rich idea of human development understood and measured differently from, I say, GDP to Human Development Index. That was probably beginning of 90s, right? The decades of development. And then going into, I think recently they've been added HDI, which is the inequality corrected Human Development Index. So kind of the same thing happens when it comes to looking at needs of humanitarian of disaster-affected populations. We're starting to look more broadly at what the needs might be, and that happens at the same time also with what we call the data revolution. Obviously, access to information and the ability to be able to analyze and collect is shifted drastically from the 50s until like early 90s, and then even more so accelerating right now in 21st century. And that can be seen as something that is, you know, a sign of professionalization and overall progress and improvement. And I think those of you who are more quant, I'm thinking, would definitely probably side more with that way of understanding of that process. But there's obviously, and we're already going into some of the interesting bits, maybe about the criticism and the arguments within that space, that this is an optimistic version of seeing that whole arc, but there would be voices that would say that there are also some more perverse effects of data revolution on the humanitarian aid. And it comes both from maybe looking at the fact that perhaps we are underestimating the impact of data, and the fact that in humanitarian space, it can be of rather mediocre quality because of the issues of access and the fact that the research that is happening within the humanitarian space is not as rigorous as you might want it to be because of multiple issues, but also it's because not the researchers are doing that research and creating that data, is the practitioners who don't necessarily apply the same level of rigor that you would if it was a stable setting and done by people who are qualified specifically to do only that. Another, I think, side of criticism as well. So that's basically the, you know, that, because this is, I think many people who work in that space would quite relate to that. It is to an extent, in some places, in some contexts, with some organizations, I can't, you know, say the names, but that might be an issue. Another thing is from more, I would say, Foucauldian side of things, criticism, and is about the idea that adding quantification to humanitarian space is a form of adding like a neoliberal paradigm to humanitarian space. That it's basically adding control, which is economic control, to the aid space, and potentially putting NGOs in competition with themselves to attain certain levels of quantifiable outcomes, but also giving donors control over NGOs to have to attain to certain levels of credibility using quantifiable evidence, and creating competition within the NGO space to be able to attain those let's say thresholds or indicators. I'll get to the indicators in a moment. I'm not sure if you had the chance to even just leaf through some of the readings that I've sent, but basically it's pointing to that as well. It's not as straightforward as just following the 4 principles. Actually, there's also a lot that is scientific, but is it really, and is it really adding to the quality, or is it just creating something which is very kind of capitalist liberal? Oh, we can. Yeah. So, well, I think what's interesting about the sphere, and we'll get to that in a moment, is that there's been like quite a robust process behind agreeing on those things. But now, what MSF is, I think, said is that is it a Bible because we've reached a certain level of consensus, or is it just another publication that is point of reference, and therefore donors, for instance, cannot make us 100% accountable for reaching those because it's a pointer, but it's not a Bible. And it creates an illusion maybe that this is something that everybody has unanimously agreed based on science that is supposed to be the point of reference. But in fact, there are researchers who are more historians who are actually looking into the process of how those standards were conceived. And they basically unravel that within the documentation about how this was being born. There was a lot of disagreement, and in the end, it's democracy more than science. Like more people agree to side with one version of what is the minimum standard for number of calories, or a minimum number of liters of water, or square spaces when it comes to shelter, etc. So I think it's just something to keep in mind as well, because depending on who you talk to and whether it's discussion directed towards general public, donor, or internal discussions, it is much more rich or much more kind of like suggesting that this is science and this is something that is unanimous. All right. One other thing that I wanted to say around that is that those discussions are not new. Basically, the controversies around the nature of evidence in humanitarian settings have started already in around 2000s, I would say, really quite intensely. There was a very good publication that was in 2000 by ODI, which is a think tank, a British think tank, quite renowned, where they basically looked more at the funding. So I think I've suggested that in the readings. It's the one which is called According to Need, that one. And that one is basically looking more at whether the financing is actually following any evidence in terms of where the money is being directed and how the decision makers decide which appeal is going to get more funding as an envelope, as opposed to some others which might get a little bit underfunded. And their conclusions in 2000s, and that was a trigger for huge discussion within the sector, were quite damning. So what they were saying is basically that financing is not equitable. So the amounts allocated across various projects do not reflect really the comprehensive and comparative levels of needs across the world. And there's no one system, no wide framework that is judging the relative severity of the needs and situations to be able to align decisions about funding to respond accordingly. And then, which is relevant for today's seminar, lecture, however we call this, it was also that both donors are very skeptical about the quality of the assessments that NGOs are actually making to be able to make decisions about the level of needs. And on the other hand, the NGOs are quite skeptical about the decisions of the donors where to allocate the money, because they don't believe necessarily that the central agenda behind donor thinking is actually the need, because they are quite often linked to political agendas, because they're quite often linked to government money, because it comes from taxes, etc. So there's all that has to be also kind of taken into consideration. It's an ongoing discussion. How much freedom do NGOs have in order to decide how they want to spend their money and where to spend it? Okay, what are the main types of assessments that I could talk about when about humanitarian assessments? So this is not an exhaustive typology. These are just the most, I would say, notorious examples of assessments that you'll be doing in humanitarian settings. On one hand, those are the rapid assessments. So the ones that are kind of cross-cutting and they're done immediately after a disaster occurs. And it's all about just having a very quick snapshot of the situation and knowing what are the immediate needs, whether it's food or whether it's more shelter, kind of just getting a very general, quick and dirty, they call them, picture of the situation. The second type focuses on needs and speaking to the actual population and trying to understand more comprehensively what are the specific needs of affected people. So now we're going down not to just like assessing infrastructure, the crops affected, or was it the buildings? What's the type of disaster, but also looking at the specific needs of the population. The third one that I would say is quite notorious as well is the vulnerability assessment, which is again not the first generation type of thinking about needs, but the one that kind of evolved and kind of became more prevalent, say, starting from the 90s. So looking at the factors that contribute to the vulnerability of the affected population and looking at the nexus between, well, if we are addressing something, how can we make sure that the intervention is not just looking at the immediate needs, but how that fits into the recovery phase already. And also the space within which I would say I work most, because when we work on the project, we need to have a baseline that allows us to establish what is the entry point of needs so that we can benchmark in a start and set ourselves targets where we want to get at the end of this intervention. So whether it's food security or whether it's water, so water and sanitation, We're looking at the needs at the moment of entry, so the moment we launch the project, and where we want to get within the space of a year, because normally that's the horizon of humanitarian interventions. It wouldn't be normally going beyond a year of immediate results that you would be able to achieve. And that's the difference between humanitarian also and development, that the humanitarian projects would be, the project cycle stage is much shorter. So your outcomes are much more immediate and limited in time and scope. What I wanted to say is as well, maybe a little bit more about the strengths and weaknesses of all of those four, because sometimes you would be making a choice about whether you want to go for the baseline, or maybe baseline is not possible to do because you're not even there at the moment that the aid needs to start to be delivered. An example of that would be that you have a flooding, flash flood in northern part of South Sudan, and from rapid assessment, you know that it's a flood, and therefore what you know already is that you need food and you need provisional shelter. You're now going to go and do first a baseline study in order to be able to deliver aid. So what you will be actually basing you're doing your benchmark is the international standards of where you want to get at the end of the intervention, but you're not going to be doing any surveys with those people before you start giving them the support. Depends. So it really depends on the type of a disaster of crisis. Also, probably I should maybe introduce in here that when we talk about disasters, they can be rapid onset, slow onset, and protracted crisis. So depending on the nature of the disaster that we're talking about, or we are able to deploy different types of assessments. And like I said, the rapid assessments will be basically done probably together with already deploying people to be able to deliver aid. But we have, when in situations where you have more time because it's a protracted crisis. So it's a flooding that is kind of increasing gradually. We have that situation now in Unity in South Sudan. That was the first example that came to my mind because I've been working on it recently. Then the water levels are just creeping up and they're never receding. And it's been like the last 3 years basically. And obviously you were there and you are able to deploy something which is much more structured. When we talk about quantitative data collection, most of the time, because there will be people on the ground, you would be able to use survey questionnaires. And these days, you rarely see doing any data collection without using digital data gathering. So in humanitarian settings, that means ODK or COBOL, very oftentimes. In practical terms, that means that there is a team which isn't necessarily on the ground who designs the questionnaire, and then people on the ground have tablets and they just go, and as they do things which are related to implementation, they also collect the data, whether it is baseline or it's routine monitoring of the rollout for the purposes of measuring improvements or accountability to the affected population, asking for their feedback about the quality of health. Depends. Again, it's never going to be following a very rigorous study design. So if you think about applying anything that you know from statistics, that is going to happen very, very rarely. And again, I was talking about that a moment ago with Professor Fels. In humanitarian settings, as much as we know that randomized control trials, for instance, would be the golden standard for anything that we want to do to prove. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's an ongoing conversation, but many people would say that that's the way, to be able to prove whether something works. If you want to talk about impact, then this is the golden standard to measure impact. That is rarely possible to do in projects environment, and especially in humanitarian settings. So even quasi-experimental design is very challenging. normally you would be looking at trying to have a sample which is representative for the population of interest. So you'd use some form of randomization for sure, if you can, and then develop a sample size based on your understanding of what's the population that you're working with, and try to use the same for the end line. So the baseline end line would give you an idea within the confidence intervals that you can establish of what's the difference, what kind of difference you've made. But the attribution obviously is very complicated there, because you don't have a counterfactual. And constructing counterfactual in humanitarian settings is ethically very complicated. And I think we will talk about it also in a moment. Because obviously, to give or not to give, how can you possibly imagine that you're going to create a control group and just not give people aid because you would like to have a counterfactual? In protracted crisis, you might be able to do something which is more along the lines of phased-in approach, where you can start and then the next cohort can be a comparison for a moment in time. Or you can design it by testing different types of support and seeing the results at the end line of how different combinations of support ultimately contributes to the outcomes that you've set for yourself in the project. But again, that really requires more of a protracted crisis situation, right? Otherwise, you're quite stuck with non-experimental type of research. And I'm talking about research already because, as I will probably, you can probably sense that there's a lot of switching between, and I'll talk about it later, the practitioner hat and researcher hat. You need some understanding of the social sciences and research approaches to be able to do this, but you won't necessarily be able to adhere to all the research principles when trying to do the work as a practitioner. Yeah. And I think you probably had the time already to read through some of the strengths and weaknesses of each and every of them. It's not rocket science. And I think it's quite clear that when time is of key issue, you want to go for rapid. If you have more time all the way down to the baseline studies, that's what you probably want to do. And you'll be able then to more precisely, but still with all the caveats that we just discussed, measure your effects of your intervention without the attribution necessarily being as clear as we would want that to be. Sorry, I'm going to pause in here for a moment. Do you guys have any questions? People are on Zoom. Is it clear so far?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah?
Yeah, I have one question, for example, if we would be considering situation like currently, for example, in the UK, I think it's quite a hot topic as well with the cost of living crisis. What type of intervention would be then used for this? Like which one of those options would that be? Baseline surveys or vulnerability assessments?
In the UK, can you expand on that? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Like it's just an example, but just generally like with the increasing poverty because of the cost of living crisis and like more and more families in need kind of. So food banks, for example, are providing more help and facilities. So in this case, kind of like long-term potential crisis, but it's not like third world countries, let's say, like which one would go for this? I'm not entirely sure if I would like understand the whole division here.
Yeah, so I think we have to start by saying that whatever is happening right now in terms of what we call crisis in UK wouldn't be called necessarily humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and therefore, by definition, it's a stable setting where you're not limited for sure to any of the considerations that I'm talking about right now. You can definitely deploy resources, and you have enough time to be able to go all the way research and look at very rigorous types of studies. So I think humanitarian settings, we have to separate that from considerations that you would apply to the type of crisis that you're talking about right now.
Okay.
The cost of living crisis in Europe, which I would say definitely qualifies as stable setting.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, access issues, funding issues, access, by access I mean security, it's not a problem, and therefore you can definitely go with very rigorous studies to be able to look at all types of vulnerability assessments and longitudinal studies, probably panel, cross-sectional, anything that you would probably want to deploy as possible to do. So slightly different context than the one that I'm talking about right now. Not sure that answers, yeah? Yep. Okay, going further. So what I felt was interesting to talk about today was this would be more of an introduction to everything, is the controversies around different approaches to quantifying humanitarian needs, because I feel that's my attempt of trying to prime you with the discussions within the sector, with the discourses that are governing certain decisions, and then probably once you kind of internalize those polarizing forces and polarizing discourses, you will be able to see them much more in people speaking about certain interventions and how they approach them and what methods they've been using. Because I mean, in spite of the benefits of this evidence-based humanitarianism, so the adding more data, adding more quantifying the needs, there's a lot of discussion about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and to what extent, basically. So the first and the obvious one, I suppose, is the one which I think you're battling anyway within any social science. Yeah, it's a very old war, and it. Yeah, and I agree. I think we are more and more able to overcome the conundrum between like whether we want to go and establish our baselines or do our needs assessment based on qualitative or quantitative data. And the mixed methods approaches are becoming more and more popular. But you will hear, especially because it is all interrelated. Again, the quantitative aspects of needs assessment will be going along lines of this is a great thing to have because we have information. Information is power. Information is just basically giving us this great tool to be able to then make clear-cut, objective decisions. But is it really, because of all the issues that I've talked about? Because is this data really representative? Is it collected in a way in which it guarantees that it actually is the source of unanimous objective information about the population? And this is something that's going to come back as well over and over again. The production of knowledge in the form of quantitative data is a very Western concept. Humanitarian work is happening mostly in what we will call global South, for the lack of better expression. That divide, of course, I'm calling it, but I think what is maybe more important to focus when we talk about that is that the production of knowledge, which is based on quantitative data, is a very Western concept. We're trying to apply it to a context where the idea of confidence interval is completely foreign, and where the production of knowledge and understanding of the world is very much qualitative. But what becomes the challenge is that when we talk about accountability, when we talk about calls for proposals to be able to fund things, and we are talking about impact, the drive, both on the side of the community and also the donors, is more to produce and present quantitative data, right? So as much as, yes, in the research space, we've come up with mixed methods, and we understand that the best of the two worlds is basically is maybe the solution. In humanitarian setting, it is still an ongoing discussion, especially that one of the most recent, again, it shouldn't be recent, but it's very post-colonial in a way that we still talk about this as something that we need to battle, is how do you include the affected population in a meaningful way in the process of defining the needs and responding to them in a participatory manner. So what's the capacity of the local population to engage with quantitative data? And how we can translate that data into something that is understood, absorbed, and taken up and analyzed in conjunction together with population of interest. And I think again it varies. It's not a clear cut. There's no clear cut solution. There's no easy answer to that. When we talk about disasters, they can also happen in places where the literacy levels and education levels can be high. Think about Syria, where like majority of people that we work with are very well educated. But when you translate that into a concept of Congo, let's say, we're talking about people who live in very rural area, very remote, language issues to even start with. Everything that comes with that, the education levels, literacy levels are very low, and therefore working with quantitative data to be able to explain what you're trying to do with numbers is very challenging. Even the research methods that you would be using in those spaces would vary drastically, and you wouldn't probably, when you want to do an assessment of needs, you wouldn't go with a questionnaire. Maybe you would want to actually resort to something which is called participatory rural appraisal, where you basically take stones and try to have a conversation with a village, when you kind of use stones and piles of stones to rank what is the preferred way of going ahead with certain types of needs, whether we would address them in this way or that way. This is just an example. Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't disagree. For sure. No, it's just, again, it's a matter of like how much time you have to be able to design your research, and how much control do you have over the context of the research to be able to deploy all of those things. Yeah. It is definitely happening in the humanitarian setting. Don't get me wrong. We're talking about, I mean, in terms of production of data in humanitarian setting, I'm trying to talk more about the assessments to identify the needs. When it comes to monitoring the humanitarian settings, it's a slightly different discussion because those really exist and they're quite advanced. If you look at WFP's, for instance, VAM, which is a global website which look at vulnerability assessment monitoring, it's a place where you can basically zoom in at any given population. And again, people would argue that there are gaps that they're hiding and you can't really see some of those gaps because they're not very obvious. But that is by all means happening. The generation of quite high quality data related to monitoring the vulnerability, for instance, in that case, of populations in the protracted emergency setting, definitely exists. And therefore, it's like, again, this discussion, this is just one of the conundrums in here. I would like to say it's dead, but it's not dead, because of what you just said, that there's a problem of whether people actually are able to use the most advanced ways of looking and working with quantitative data, but also whether in certain circumstances it's the best way to go, and which one to choose if it's a qualitative approach, which one to actually choose, so that the principles of participatory research are actually fulfilled. So I mean, we could have a separate seminar just on that. But I just wanted to say that it's as, you know, this discussion is as present as in humanitarian research as it would be in probably any other type of research. We just discuss forever and drill into examples. So I'll leave it to that for the quantitative versus qualitative, because that was just an intro one, which is the obvious one. The second one, which is related, is the one that I actually wanted to kind of like segue from the qualitative to quantitative one, is the idea about the approaches to needs assessment, which is what we would call top-down versus bottom-up. And there the arguments are first and foremost from the types of needs that you would identify using one or the other approach. Because with the top-down, normally you would use some set of predefined categories and indicators that you're searching, whether they exist or don't exist within the population. And obviously that is limiting, but it helps standardization. And I'm going to talk about it in a moment. The bottom-up would mean that you engage with the population and let the population in Madagascar, Congo, Nepal, Syria, Ukraine to define the needs and then design your programs accordingly. So the arguments for one or the other come also from the efficiency and standardization, meaning that if you use a top-down, you're actually being much more efficient because you can do it much faster. Going bottom-up means that you have to spend much more time trying to understand first the population in order to be able to really get to the bottom of what they're talking about, and then try to, again, quantify it to some extent in order to be able to measure it. There are the arguments from the empowerment level as well for one or the other. And obviously the bottom up would be identified as the ones that actually give the power to the people, because they allow them to be able to express themselves and basically be able to identify their own needs according to their own belief systems, but also culture and context. And then the last one, which localization in aid is a very broad subject. It doesn't mean just what the word means. It's a whole concept, and the concept basically stands for giving more power, again, in the discourse and defining things to the local population and local NGOs as well. Because as much as I am now speaking from the level of international NGO, we are also in a position of power versus the local NGOs, which don't necessarily have the same level of credibility in the eyes of the donors, and therefore their access to be able to define, get the funding and also work more effectively with the local population is very different. And there's an entire whole sea of literature which talks about how to advance the localization agenda, which speaks exactly to that. How to make sure that more money is spent through the channels or and through the local actors, so that majority of aid is not spent on bureaucracy and paying salaries of people, international people around the world, but actually is being pumped straight to the population through the hands of the local NGOs and giving the money with lower overheads. And so basically using the bottom-up approaches and working with the local population and local NGOs advances that agenda and allows us to potentially better utilize the money, if we had to boil it down to like a short and sweet summary. And it's a very lively discussion in here because many donors are scared because of the accountability to give too much money to the local organizations with the risks of fraud, with the risks of diversion, especially in conflict areas. There is a lot of discussion around that. And the responsibilities oftentimes left to organizations like mine, for instance, intermediate organizations, to take all the risk of any possible diversion. So the donors don't want to have that responsibility. Obviously, ECHO, so Humanitarian Office of European Union, would say an international NGO is responsible for making sure that through the partnership agreements and all the types of scanning and testing that we do with the local organizations, that none of the money is ever going to end up in the hands of people related to armed groups. How do you ensure that? It's a separate, obviously, a seminar, and probably there's no easy way of answering that, but it's a burden that is put on the actors to make sure that on one hand, as much as possible, we work through the local actors, but at the same time to let them define the needs and respond to them in the most appropriate way. But at the same time, the risks are enormous, and they are both actual in terms of security, but also reputational to the organizations. What else? So yeah, exactly. This is just summarizing basically what I was saying in terms of accountability. The first point, and the bottom up really also coincides what I wanted to say with the ideas that are emerging more broadly again about what we call human-centered approaches. Because again, in here, we're trying to look at more holistically at the human needs and allowing them to express themselves in the natural language of the population of interest. And something that I was trying to probably explain, but written up, it sounds much more smart, is that by giving people the right to be able to express themselves in that way, we're actually actively working on removing the existing biases. The biases that we are to some extent maybe aware of, because obviously we can learn about biases and question ourselves, but there are biases that we won't be able to eradicate otherwise with anything else but just giving the voice and the agency to the people who are oftentimes subject of those biases. So I think it's both applicable to how we implement, but like equally how we research, and whether it is for the purposes of the practitioner hat types of researchers, but also the academic researchers. I'm sure. Do you have any courses about biases in cultural biases and all types of biases, not data necessarily, systematic biases, but the biases that you might be applying in the course of your research when working with the population? before you can make and apply different social norms to be adjusted, making, but not I suppose the more you go further from your cultural context, the more it becomes important. And I think we have a tendency to look at biases as when the culture is really far, and we kind of like apply the anthropological way of looking at the difference and trying to remove ourselves and our own implicit judgments and values. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is that especially in humanitarian context, when you work with like populations which are very drastically different from the ones that you come oftentimes culturally you're very, very removed. And it used to be that it's enough to just understand the culture, so to read about, let's say, Myanmar. I'm going to read about the politics of it. I'm going to read about history. I'm going to read a bit about everything that's available, and therefore I'll understand the biases. I will be able to kind of somehow overcome those issues, without necessarily looking at the compounding effects within the population of the cultural heritage, of the training of the people that you meet. So we verify our relationship to the culture as if the culture where we actually operate was somehow static and uniform. And then when we engage with that culture, when we engage with this environment, we don't apply the same level of understanding of the complexity of that context that we would apply when we were analyzing our own culture. Because if I was doing this in Poland, I would know what are the differences in social classes, and here I would be able to probably understand better the dynamics between academia and vocational schools, and I'll be able to better understand when someone is speaking from one or the other, that they speak from a position of power or the lack of thereof. And I think what is really important when we like looking at needs in context which we don't understand is it's not just the culture that we need to understand. We also need to understand the power dynamics within that culture, and that will be a source of many biases that people will be introducing to the definition of needs, depending on how they're positioned within that culture. So when we trying to again survey or go deploy qualitative methods for defining needs, we need to be very conscious of that and try to sample conveniently, like using convenience something, so that the voices are representative. To give you a very practical example, you go to an area which is very rural, and there you would think everybody is rural, right? So like, let's just do focus group discussions. But within that space, you would have women and men. You will have many ethnic groups with different levels of power. You will have the village chiefs, and you would have the regular people. You would have the newcomers versus original settlers. Potentially, you will have IDPs, so internally displaced people. All of that introduces power dynamics, which would definitely introduce also different ways of understanding of what the needs are and how to address them. And therefore, it's just the bottom-up approaches, again, if you just deploy the survey without proper stratification, which again, you can correct it with a good stratification, but can you really do that in those settings, really understand it from the quantitative point of view, and really deploy that kind of a survey that's going to map out all of those problems? Very difficult, because you don't even have a census to start with. And therefore, it's your qualitative intervention, research-wise, and your understanding of all those biases that might be able to get you closer to the truth than the more quantitative approach. And that's why you should never do it on your own. Like any design and any choice of informants that you might be using has to be done, again, bottom up, through a consultation with the local representatives, so that to be able to make up your mind jointly about what are actually the power relationships there, who is speaking from which perspective, and to be able to understand those perspectives before you start taking them into account and interpret them. So I guess this is what I was just trying to get at, that it's a big challenge because those are places that you don't understand at all, and there's no literature probably that can actually give you specificity of that particular area before a disaster occurs and you actually end up working in that space. Yeah.
Could you tell more a bit how on practical level does it look like this actually recruitment or sampling or consultations with like the local communities? Do you have like translators who are facilitating this, or you just like delegate it entirely to like collaborators from that areas? How does it, like, it's hard to imagine for me at least.
Yeah, good question. I mean, it really depends on a couple of different things. Obviously, there's no one recipe how that happens. I would say the first thing that we have to know that is going to condition a lot of how you're going to be able to work is whether your organization has already presence in that area or not. So imagine, for instance, that you're working, let's say Congo. Congo is basically the size of DRC, is the size of Europe. So you might have your presence in that country, but not necessarily in the area in which you are responding to an emergency. And so it will be different. If you have your presence already, then the chances are you have already a list of your key stakeholders because you are, for instance, running a health program there and you're working with the health facilities. So you understand already who is who in that space, because the basis for launching a program is speaking to the local leader, being able to do the stakeholder mapping and understanding probably from the previous programming, what's the population, what's the how is it constructed in terms of like ethnic groups, the number of people living, etc. So when you know that already, then you have a really great point of entry to be able to do emergency cash distributions because of flash flooding or something that happens, which could be a raid of an armed force that kind of just raised the village, and I need to help those people to reestablish their livelihoods. So if you know the area already, then your half of your work is already kind of facilitated through your understanding of the context, which is probably just quite good already. And there you can start deciding with your team, depending on the type of need, how you want to approach the understanding of how to respond to them. So then you would probably construct yourself a list of key informants that you would first need to talk to. And then if it's feasible and if that adds if you believe that adds to your understanding, you might want to do something quantitative. So come up with like needs assessment survey, which is going to be modular. I think I gave you an example in the readings of basic needs assessment guidance, which is trying to basically deconstruct how you might want to approach defining basic needs for the population to be able to understand what are the needs and what is the gap. Because the ultimate thing that you're searching for is that if I understand how do we define basic needs in this community, then I want to also know what is missing right now. So what is the gap that I need to fill in with my intervention? And they basically present, I'm referring you to the one of the readings. It's the one that's called Background and Concepts on Basic Needs, where they are analyzing different approaches, promoting the basic needs one, which is a quantitative one, and contrasting it with others like household economy approach, which is very much qualitative, and trying to show what are the benefits of using one or the other and how they can be complementary. But normally there's no one way of approaching this, and it's going to be a conversation at the country level with your programming team of how much time do we have really, and what do we know already about the population. There are cases where really you don't need to do anything because the population is so well researched. Like for instance, nowadays in northeast Syria, where there is so much data being produced already, that what you need to do is basically reach out to an agency called REACH, which is a specific NGO that deals only with needs assessment, and they can provide you with the information that you need in order to be able to design it. So it really, really differs depending on the context and your existing understanding of the situation. It's not a given that you have to actually do any data collection. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's actually a waste of time. And you should just do what you would call desk review. Reach out to your partners already in the area and just listen to that and design based on this information. Does it answer to an extent? It's a broad subject, Susan.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Cool. I'm a little bit conscious of time that we are a little bit behind. So the third thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to the controversies is the whole idea of having minimum standards for performance. And that was something that I was trying to point to when suggesting reading the introduction to the Sphere Handbook. Because Sphere is one of the prime examples of those efforts of trying to standardize and professionalize aid. It was born from the idea that we need to improve the quality of the assistance that's being delivered to the populations. And therefore that there needs to be an agreement across the sector of what it means that aid is provided in a quality way that is actually living up to standards which are acceptable to all the actors working in that humanitarian space. So Sphere Handbook basically is trying to answer to that question and to that need in a very particular way, which has raised some questions and controversies in the humanitarian space. The most vocal critic from a certain moment on of the idea of having something like Sphere was MSF. And MSF was quite vocal about the fact, as much as in the beginning, they were very much keen to participate in a global effort of trying to standardize things. What happened in the process of trying to develop those standards is that they became too rigid. They became too rigid and they became too bureaucratic, which translates into an understanding of those minimum standards as something that is fixed and is not really advancing humanitarian agenda, but is more creating this corporate-like culture where what's most important is living up to standards, which, like, again, we talked about it a moment ago, are treated as science, than really reflecting actively each time you engage with the population and trying to understand what is the best, most moral and most humanitarian way of responding to a crisis. And it's a real, very, very lively discussion, because MSF is speaking from a position which is very unique in humanitarian sector. Why? I'm not sure if that's a common knowledge or no, but not many organizations have the liberty to use funding which is not coming from any government or international institution. MSF is purely funded from donations, which means that their accountability to any agendas, calls which are defined sectorally. For instance, ECHO will say, in this country, we want to this year respond mostly to health and nutrition. They're not bound by any of those definitions of the needs. They can respond purely based on their understanding of the context in which they operate. And therefore they have much more liberty and are much more loud about anything that in their view contradicts the four humanitarian principles, which should be the basis always and forever, and no one has ever questioned that officially or openly, should be the basic principles for how the aid is supposed to be delivered. So I think it's a very interesting space to really read about and to engage with, because it makes you think. On one hand, it is really good, and and there's no doubt that there was a need for standardization, but the extent to which standardization, is supposed to be the sole point of reference of success is at least dubious. Dubious is at least, at least dubious, and there's definitely space, especially from the academic point of view, to engage with that and question that in a productive way. And it's a really, really good entry point to look at measuring anything really in humanitarian space, because technically you can always find a point of reference of what would be the ideal solution for humanitarian need, and see whether an intervention lives up to those minimum standards or not. But then, more broadly, you can always ask yourself, was that the best way of defining the minimum performance? And is that ultimately the goal when we think about the well-being and the needs, understood again more broadly, of the population, of the affected population? I guess I'm not sure if you had a chance to maybe look at some of those chapters which define a little bit more in detail the minimum standards. But if you didn't, I wanted to maybe refer to some of the ones that to me seem quite interesting, to just give you a teaser of like how that can look like. So the first chapters obviously define the goal, sphere, and how it was born, and also the role of monitoring and evaluation in the whole process of ensuring that that the aid is delivered in complying with those standards. But then each and every chapter has an introduction then on the sector, what the sector means. So there's water supply, health and nutrition, shelter, and then it gets to a place where they actually define the indicators. So to give you an example of an indicator, I'm looking at page 100 of the Sphere handbook. It says, key indicators. All affected households have access to the minimum quantity of essential hygiene items. 2 water containers per household, 10 to 20 liters, 1 for collection, 1 for storage. Next point, 250, not more, not less, grams of soap for bathing per person per month. 200 grams of soap for laundry per person per month. Soap and water at a hand washing station, 1 hand station per shared toilet per 1 household, and potty, scoop, and nappies to dispose of children's feces. It's very prescriptive. And believe me that it is prescriptive in here. It sounds rigid, and you would think that there is a lot of space to negotiate that, but very often times when you end up writing proposals and being accountable to donors, this is exactly what you will be accountable for. And when the evaluation comes, this will be the minimum standards against which you will be evaluated. Evaluation is a double-edged sword. Yes, it can tell you what went well and what didn't go so well, and it's a source of learning, but it's also a source of reputational credibility. And damning evaluations can also undermine your ability to be able to receive further funds. I could go into more details, and I have a couple of those marked up in here, but I'm really conscious of time. I don't want to do that. I would just really recommend for you to, if you have a chance, have a look at the Spheres handbook and search for many other examples, which are quite interesting in other sectors of how those things are being defined. Because it's not necessarily common knowledge, but it is quite fascinating. And there is further literature if you're interested about how those are being born and how agreement there is around certain concepts. I think the most fascinating from my personal point of view is the one that talks to nutrition. And what are the minimum standards in terms of caloric input and dietary diversity, which should be a point of reference for everyone when implementing food security programs. Okay, and the last one that I wanted to touch when it comes to the controversies is about the approach, which would be defined as needs-based versus rights-based. And I wanted to use one particular example of how that dichotomy is being applied using something which is called MEB. So a little bit of background in the last, I would say, 10 years, especially, but it started at the beginning of the century. There's been a big push to stop looking at aid as being sectoral. So let's stop looking at shelter separately from food, separately from education, separately from health, and let's look at all of that as needs that can be partially answered through markets. And we don't have to bring in food or shelter items, buckets, soap from Europe or from anywhere, because those things very oftentimes can be delivered through the market. If you give people the money, they will be able to buy it. And that gives them the right to be able to decide what their needs are. We don't have to assess the needs. We just have to know whether what they need can be delivered through the market, and then they can decide in a dignified way what they actually want to buy and what's the priority in a given month, in a given situation. Someone got sick, so the priority is actually medicine. Next month it's going to be school fees, right? So it comes from that, the MEB. So MEB is just an operational tool that allows us to be able to identify and quantify in this particular context, what are the average costs of what we would call the basic needs basket, and to be able to satisfy through the prices available on the local market. And then looking at the needs-based side of things, if you wanted to answer what is that amount using the needs-based approach, what they call expenditure-based approach, they would be looking at surveys which are looking at the actual expenditure patterns. So we'll be looking at asking people how they spend their money and being able to establish what is the minimum threshold to be able to meet the minimum needs and quantify them in terms of cash in local currency to be able to provide the gap that is not delivered, that they can't reach with their own resources, to be able to, you know, top up to what we establish as a minimum expenditure basket. A rights-based approach would say that is crazy. That is completely wrong, because the expenditure patterns of people in difficult situations are drastically different from the ones that you would expect to see in a place where everything is fine, because their horizon is limited, because the amount of goods available on the market is also going to be very different. So you could never, you know, establish your minimum expenditure basket based on how people spend money, because that's already distorted by the situation in which they operate. Yes, but also the point in here that's being made is that people possibly maybe can't even imagine what is their right in terms of what they should be able to access. And therefore, the needs should be derived not from the resources available around them, but what we believe from the human rights point of view is their basic right. So it should be defined from that angle and not distorted by the opportunities and their expenditure patterns, which are heavily skewed by their situation, right? Yeah, and it's an ongoing discussion every time, because you probably, I'm not sure that was clear from the reading, but in the reading, it also said that it's a process. MEB is a process, and each MEB in each country will be different, and it has to have a buy-in of all the stakeholders that are working within that space, because it's an interagency tool, which means that different, both donors and organizations have to come together and come up with one MEB, because it can't be that my organization, let's say organization A, decides that the minimum expenditure basket is amount X, and another one that it's amount Z, because based on that you make programmatic decisions, and it would create tensions within the community if one organization was topping up with $100 and another one with $500, depending on which approach they want to use, because it has obviously implication on how big the amount will be. The size of the amount of the MEP is not just NGOs. It also can be very political, just to be clear. In the context of Lebanon, for instance, where we have a huge population of Syrians being displaced and pushed into Lebanon, the agencies were trying to establish MEP, and when they looked at the more rights-based approach to defining the amount of MEP, they ended up with an amount which was higher than the minimum wage in Lebanon. You can imagine how politically difficult it would be to basically say that this should be the minimum expenditure basket if the minimum wage is lower than that for the local population given by the government. It couldn't go through. So it's a very discursive and very political and sensitive subject, but it's a very interesting one to follow and try to always see whether and understand when you hear someone speaking about those things, are they speaking from the rights-based or the needs-based corner? Because that, depending on which angle they speak from, the conclusions could be very different. And using that framework to be able to engage with it is quite useful. When you read articles, when you listen to people talking about it, but also when you're trying to assess whether something has reached its objective. The objectives will be defined by whether you were talking from the expenditure, so to say, defined minimum needs or the rights-based. And obviously, again, global north with the global south versus global south, the rights-based approaches can be defined from one or the other. But what we would call the rights-based approach, which are defined from the Western perspective, the minimum standards for what we would say is the diverse diet, doesn't include avocado, maybe everywhere, Just obviously that's a joke, but I mean, it really is quite contextual, and it has to be done based on the understanding of the local context. Even the rights-based approach have to be contextualized. There's no universal understanding of what's the minimum right in a given place beyond the minimum human rights, obviously. So the example of that I wanted to probably focus on was if you apply that to food, the expenditure-based idea would have been that we'd be looking at the food basket that the households are actually buying, right? And there would be always that minimum calorical average of calories quantity per day, because that's anyway more or less what people would normally consume, and it's kind of that standard that was an average across all contexts that was sort of agreed already at the international level. But in the contrast to the rights-based approach, in the expenditure base, it wouldn't be looking at the nutritional density of the products that you would be buying. So you might be meeting your minimum calorie quantity, but you wouldn't be looking at necessarily having a very diverse and healthy diet. And therefore, and then there's the conclusion over there, you have to be very much aware of the fact that if you're looking at, in any context, at the diet which is supposed to be nutritionally valuable and dense, you're looking at increasing your cost by at least 50, if not 100%. So that's just a very, very practical example of like, and it applies probably to your diet as well. Student diet versus whatever, it's the same. But it's a very, very, very important point to keep in mind, because obviously, if you're working with a population where you have high levels of malnutrition among children, malnutrition is defined both in terms of caloric intake, but also micronutrient intake. And the micronutrient deficiencies with children with less than 5 years old, they have lifelong consequences for their physical and cerebral development. So you can't just forget it. The first five years, the first 1,000 days of child's life is the most crucial period, and the damage done during that period is irreversible. So from that point of view, in humanitarian setting, you can't just forget it, because it's not just the immediate needs to survive that difficult period, but if it's hitting the first 5 years of a child's life, it's going to have a lifelong effect on their health. Okay, so that was really all that I wanted to talk about in terms of controversy. I know we started 15 minutes later, so we have still about 2 minutes of what would have been an hour and a half. So I wanted to just quickly wrap up with maybe talking a little bit more to the role of monitoring and evaluation. Why is this happening? Are you still seeing those things? Well, so the role of monitoring and evaluation in the process of generating evidence. So obviously, what I was talking about is impacting the decisions that we make as monitoring and evaluation practitioners within the organizations, because that's the practitioner hat. Because the roles and responsibilities as M&E staff within organizations will have a very high impact on the type of research design, understood as research design within the NGO setting. So it's still called research, but it's not an academic research. You would have high impact influence on the implementation of the research design that you've decided to choose, on the data analysis, on how that data is being reported, and what's the learning that comes from that. And that's all that information, the evidence that is being provided by the M&E systems, or sometimes called NEO system, because it's monitoring, evaluation, learning, and accountability, which like normally is just one unit and then a number of people working within that unit, or people allocated to individual projects whose specific focus is just the meal part. They would be basically providing organizations with the information that is supposed to be the decision, the evidence for the decisions made around like whether to intervene or not in a given setting, what will be the nature and the scale of the intervention, how to prioritize resources among different people and locations, and what would be ultimately the program design, and what would be the planning around that, whether we're going to go with cash or in kind, for instance, depending whether the markets are functioning, whether we would be targeting pregnant and lactating women and children, or we're going to expand that because we should go with blanket targeting because the needs are high and we can't really differentiate between groups like that. Are we looking at intervening only with IDPs in an area because the host communities are okay, or are we looking again at blanket? Those are just like off the top of my head examples of what comes out of the monitoring and evaluation unit, because the needs and how we approach the needs assessment will define those decisions. So they, in a way, are the evidence that allows us to be able to effective program. And I hope that's clear. All the discussions and all the controversies that I was trying to briefly run through today will be impacting those decisions and will have a huge role in how we're going to go about them. So quantitative versus qualitative, top-down versus bottom-up, how we approach the production of knowledge from that perspective, whether we're going to use the minimum standards and which minimum standards we're going to use to be able to establish the baselines and our targets for which we will end up being accountable for, and whether we're going to use the needs-based on the rights-based approaches in order to be able to quantify things. And last but not least, the two hats. So what I was trying to say, that as you can see, you can probably recognize yourself a lot in what I'm talking about, because some of those things are very familiar to yourself, and probably you've been thinking whether very consciously in the same, using the same terms or not, in your own work. Maybe wanted to first talk about when you work in the humanitarian setting, it is not impossible that you will be wearing both hats at the same time. There are organizations, like I said, where it is possible that you will have a unit, which is basically a research unit. And there's also an option that you might be working as an implementer, a part of the implementing team, where you might be wearing both hats. But the optics, when you're working within that space, will be slightly different. And I wanted to just, if you're working from the perspective, and you will be shifting those perspectives from the implementer hat, you will be probably trying to answer different questions. And the implementer ones would be, how can I address those immediate humanitarian needs? And what is my long-term strategic objective? Those are the practical considerations that you will be looking at when you're wearing your implementer hat. You switch the hat and you go to the more researcher hat. You will be looking at trying to understand, why does this thing work, or why is it not working, and how does it work? If we want to understand really certain approach, we would like to basically deconstruct certain approaches to be able to better understand the details of that, without necessarily those implications of how does it contribute directly within the life cycle of this particular program to the goals of that program as it was defined by the program, because you're not bound as a researcher by the limits of one singular program, and you're not bound in any way to deliver on those results, because you're just researching it and you're not really part of the implementing, accountable to the donor and the population team, right? And then a couple of last remarks, basically. So to summarize, what you will be doing, switching between those two hats, is trying to basically understand the same things, but from a slightly different perspective. And what will be changing is the way you think about same questions. Could be literally the same questions you'll be asking to the people, but what will be changing is the way you think about those answers, whether they have immediate implications to your program, or they have implications for the theory and the research around the subject that this project is actually implementing. The way you will be able to prepare for your work, because obviously for research, you will have much more time. You will be able to structure your design. You will be able to really put much more intellectual work into making it robust, thought through. And what will be the ultimate outcomes of that process? Because again, and that's the last point there, as a researcher, you're not so concerned probably with how to, what are the practical implications of your findings. What you're really interested in is advancing the knowledge around the subject. It was the practitioner's concern, what you're going to do with that, and what's the practical consequence of the outcome of that research. And so I think overall it is possible to balance the two, and it is possible to both be delivering the program and trying to understand better the subject and within which the program is operating. But it's a quite difficult balance to meet, and in most organizations there would be two separate units dealing with that, and ideally there would be someone on the program side who would be linking with someone who's an academic to help design the research and let them be the independent part of the delivery of the program, so that this optics is as balanced as possible, and people who are implementing are focusing on delivering the activities and monitoring the process of the delivery, producing data that can be then used by the research to further advance and expand the understanding of the effects which are intended or unintended of the intervention. And the ethical aspects of those two processes are very different, and that's why in the humanitarian space, it's probably the most challenging bit about doing research is trying to tie the timeline of humanitarian response to the timeline of a research project. And I think I'm going to stop at that because we kind of, we've been going a little bit circles, some of those things we talked about a little bit in the beginning, but I hope it wraps up a little bit the way in which you might be thinking if you ever end up having to work within the humanitarian space or understand the types of research that might be happening within the humanitarian space. This is by no means complete or exhaustive, and I'm very aware of that. Also, I'm not an expert on any of those things, but I was trying to give you a little bit of that perspective of someone who is sometimes interacting with both, mostly on the practitioner side, sometimes having more interest in the research bit that makes our work, basically more accurate, more rich, more interesting.